Welcome to Praise, Prayer and Preaching with the Reverend Dr. Keith Garner, Superintendent and CEO of Wesley Mission.
Welcome to the Wesley Theatre. I want to take the theme Good News Bearer and taking that thought particularly from the book of Colossians and the 3rd chapter. Colossians in the New Testament has a very, very powerful message for Christian people in each and every age. It's a letter that emphasizes the centrality of Jesus Christ. There is no question that that is affirmed and reaffirmed throughout the epistle, the centrality of Jesus Christ. And more than that, his sufficiency for our daily living. That really is part of what that theme has to say to every one of us. Paul, an author, was increasingly aware that this was a Christian community in danger of losing its way. Now, any church and every church is in danger of losing its way, but this particular community had essential reasons why Paul and others that were involved, Epaphras and others that were involved in the founding of this church, might be particularly concerned. We are called to be good news bearers. That's those who demonstrate by the way we live what it is that we believe. And what we believe is driven by the way we live. We are good news bearers in our community. And any church and any community is affected and to some extent touched by the community in which it's set. And those things, the religious and cultural ideas of that community. That's why it's good that we've had a testimony here in the Wesley Theatre of somebody who was born in a very different cultural genre, which definitely influences the life of people born in Japan, just as it would if we came from any other part of the world. Where we live is an essential component, for it helps to give shape and purpose to our lives. This factor alone sets the stage for the many influences upon our lives as we grow and as we develop. A key factor in preaching from the Bible, whenever you preach from the Bible, from the Old Testament or the New Testament, is to ask questions about the life setting of the particular book or passage or context being preached upon. What is the life setting of those who would hear it for the very first time? What are the issues that are being raised for that particular culture to hear? We're all too aware here in Australia that life is very different in bush, town and city. We know that to live in a very small place in a remote part of Australia is a very different life than in Melbourne and Sydney. It really is. And we need to understand that if we're to understand what it means to live in our great country. But when we study the Bible, that too is important. If we look at our modern world, Sydney, Santiago, Seattle are not just separated by journey time. They're separated by whole lives, whole ways of looking at life. And Paul's audience, when he writes this particular document to the church at Colossae, is to a particular church in a particular setting. So what he has to say to them here may well be different than what he writes to the church at Philippi. It may be different than what is written to other particular churches. It was a city in what was known as the Lycus Valley, about 160 kilometers, 100 miles from Ephesus. And Ephesus was very much a center. It was a place where Paul centered a ministry for a period of time. And letters went out, and correspondence went out, and communication went out. A main trade route ran from the Eastern world directly through Colossae. But it was a city. And it's very rare that a preacher would say this. It's probably the only book in the New Testament. This was an unimportant city. Did you hear that? Unimportant. It had had its best days. It was no longer significant. Now, you may say, just gosh, what we usually say when we're talking about Paul is Paul preached here because this was a very important center. This had lost its way as a community and a place. It was overshadowed by a Laodicea, also by Hierapolis. If you want to read those churches at the beginning of Revelation, you'll find this is in that context, that part of the world. But many of the other churches were far, far more important. But not the challenge that this church faced. This church faced a challenge that was unique and important and from which we can learn a great deal. The gospel was probably carried to Colossae. This wasn't a case of Paul went there and preached there. It's not like Philippians where they had a meeting by the river. There was a prison experience. There was somebody who sold cloth and the gospel spread in that way. No, this was probably carried by others to this particular place. It's not a circular letter. You know that when Paul wrote the letter to the church at Ephesus, it was a letter that could have been read in any church. And although this has a reference to us today, it's not that kind of letter. And many have drawn the attention to the fact this might be the least important place that Paul ever concerned himself with. Now, we ask ourselves why. Having established those things, it's not difficult to ascertain it's not the commercial importance of this place that really matters, but it's the highly developed sense of being a cultural mix. It was a place where people of very different cultures lived together in the city. And that's why this unimportant place may be unimportant at one point in time, but might have more to say to North America, Europe, Australia, and the developed world than almost any other book in the New Testament. Even though it was comparatively insignificant. Because they were wrestling with the mix of living in the pressures of many different cultures upon themselves, of being torn apart by the different things that causes. He had a genuine regard for this community. He opens up the 3rd chapter, which was read to us earlier, with these words. Since then, you've been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Now, when I consider the earliest churches and Paul's relationship with them, where often he was directly involved in their founding, I sense an enormous pastoral concern. There were some churches that he directly brought about. There were others whom he influenced. There was an equal concern for all the churches, and not least for this one, that was going through difficult days. You could say its best days were behind it. Oh gosh, there's another message for the church of today. And to hear that. We can spend some helpful time in considering what it means to live in a setting where strange ideas infiltrate the church. And that will help us to understand why Colossians is important. There were many, many pressures, many ideas that were not in sympathy with the Christian faith, that were just slowly infiltrating life as it was in that particular community. And I think that's important. It's particularly true at a church at this point in time, living in a Western democracy, as we call ourselves, where we value openness, we honor broad-mindedness. We take ideas in because ideas exist. And after all, we are a decent people. And surely everybody's idea is equal. Well, that raises a whole host of questions that I think Colossians can be helpful in seeing our way through. In the previous passage, in chapter 2, 16 through to 23, Paul made it clear that he's not opposed to laying out guidelines on how we should live the Christian life. But equally, he is resistant to straitjackets. He knows very well that whilst we have Christian guidelines, we've got to be very sensitive that we live in a multicultural world in which living out that discipleship is very, very challenging. In those opening words, we're encouraged to set our minds. I think it's equally right for some people to say, seek. Some people talk about seeking as being the important truth that we've got to have there. The idea that lies behind it is that our thought must not be unlike that of a compass. Whether it is the South Pole or the North Pole, whenever we look at that compass, we find a setting that keeps us true. And I think that what the apostle is writing to this church is, you need to be quite clear what your setting is, what will keep you true, what will bring you back to the thing that will help you to set your way in life, the compass of spirituality. He's not suggesting that a community that belongs to Christ should be entirely detached from the world. See, that's one of the temptations that this church at Colossae could have. When ideas are all around, one of the ways some people handle different ideas is to dig a hole and get down in the hole and get away from it all. Yeah, I know that some people see that as there. I don't think that's the Christian way. And therefore, the Christian church faces challenges that many others have not had to face. We have to somehow understand what it means to follow Christ, to focus on Christ, to have our compass point on our South Pole, because we have something that will keep us true in the midst of the mix. And I think that certainly sets us apart. We must understand the difference between things above and earthly things. And this is where some of the separation comes about in some people's minds. They want to be focused on higher things. And higher things you usually close your eyes for, you usually put your hands together, and you think on beautiful things. And there is no doubt that there's some truth in that. But some of the most important things that we have to do in living in this multicultural mix that we call life in our context here in Australia, it will mean we sometimes have to get our hands dirty. We sometimes have to engage in a mix in a world and a conflict of ideas, opposition to what is true. We see that almost. Some of the things that you and I took as granted only 10 years ago, we no longer can do. We are living in a very, very different world, and the challenge is there for every one of us to keep our minds, to keep our hearts, to keep our compass firmly set on Christ, to not allow ourselves to be dragged from that center. It's expressed by Paul when he writes to the Philippians, doesn't he? When he talks about the lovely things and the good things. Chapter 4, those things should be the things that really our life is really focused upon. It's worth reading them, isn't it? Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think upon these things. That's where your compass has to be. I suppose it could be said that the truth that that we follow will decide the gravity of where our life is going to be located. So I want to paint a picture of this community of faith, not only in Colossians, but in all our lives, being a place where we are bearers of good news. And so it's there in chapter 3 later on. Whatever you do, work at it with your whole heart. We are called to be bearers of good news. This is splendid advice. These are words of encouragement. It's the call to live a fuller life. Just 2 or 3 things from it. Our total life is bound up with the gospel. Now, people understand that term, the gospel, in different ways. The gospel is much more than a book of the New Testament. It's much more than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are gospels. It's also, I have to say, and some people sometimes put their head on the side when I say this, the gospel is also more than a set of propositions. People would say, do you believe in the gospel? And I want to say, hey, hang on a minute. I want to know what you mean by that word. What do you mean by the gospel? The gospel, the euangelion, is clearly the good news about Jesus Christ. But the good news about Jesus Christ in this community here at Colossians had to be more than just an academic proposition. It had to be something that threw bridges across the wide gulfs of water that divided themselves from many who had some peculiar views about life and about what faith might be all about. And our lives are bound up with the gospel. Essentially, it's about the good news. So we are good news people. We're not just people who carry a message, but we carry a truth. We're not just people who carry a truth, we embody a truth. And we don't just embody a truth, we demonstrate what it means to live in Christ. We are bearers of the good news. For Paul, it was not only something that had happened in a point of time. For Paul, you look at 1 Corinthians 15, those first few verses there, which tell us about the gospel. For Paul, the gospel was bound up in the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, and the fact that he had been raised by God. Yes, but for Paul, it became much more than that. For him, the death of Christ meant not only something that had happened in history to Christ, but something that day by day he had to live with. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I live by faith, I live in the Son of God who died for me. So it became something that was for him a present experience. And resurrection is certainly there. For it tells us in the early part of chapter 3, it tells us in verse 3, for you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appeared, then you also will appear with him in glory. So he's writing to this community and saying, hey, don't just see the death and resurrection of Christ as something that happened to Christ in history, but see it as something that you must live with every day. That you must know what it is to die to self and be raised to the new life in Jesus Christ. In this church here, there were Christians from a Jewish background where law and all the related issues would be a priority. And there were Christians from a Gentile background where mixed ideas were brought to bear. But there were those people, many of them, who came with very mixed ideas about religion and life. And, it would be good, wouldn't it? There are places I've been in the world. I remember being, of all the places on earth, in India. And being in India, in a community of 12 million people in northeast India, of which 9.5 million were confessing Christians. Do you remember I said it was in India? I didn't say this was in Canada, the United States, Britain, Australia, in India. But they've faced many, many problems when in fact there was such a majority of the community. Now, we just had an election here. They've had elections in Europe. They've got another set coming in. Basically in all these places, we are no longer in the majority. Now, I know we'd like to think we are, and we know that if you come to our particular area, you'll find the votes way this way. But the reality is, as Christian people, it is getting more and more difficult to know how we set our compass in the right way and how we live in a mixed economy, because we need to bear our witness for Christ. We need to be good news bearers and decide what are those things that are the priority that set us apart. The relationship between the life and teaching of Jesus Christ and ourselves. There's that lovely verse that was read to us earlier in the service where Beth read, "Here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all in all." Tremendously challenging words. Slavery was a real issue. You could argue that one of the reasons why so many places in the world struggle with slavery was because they didn't get rid of it in the New Testament. The days of the New Testament, slavery was accepted as normative. And it's taken us hundreds and hundreds of years, and dare I say it's not finished yet, that we should get to a point where we realize human life is valued at such a high point, isn't it, by Christ? All people, whoever they are, wherever they're from, have such a high value. When you read this passage, I think the conviction runs much deeper. It would question, this particular book would question superior and inferior structures, black and white relationships, latecomers and indigenous, rich and poor relationships, employed and unemployed, culturally accepted and those denied, and so the list could go on. It has something to say to every one of us. But secondly, total life is joined up because of the gospel. Putting aspects of life into separate compartments is one of the ways we deal with life. When something gets difficult, we say, well, I'll put that on the shelf over here. And I want to say religious people have been past masters at it. That when we found things difficult, we stick things in the difficult drawer, the not too easy drawer, or the one I'll look at when things feel a little better. And part of the cause of this is negative. Sometimes it has helped us to protect ideals and things that we're about. But for the Colossian Christians, there needed to be a vital link between loving God and living out life. These people were amongst the first to take word and deed ministry seriously because they got no choice. They hadn't got the dominance of a religious system that put them in the driving seat. They had to work out faith when it was very, very difficult. It also means a discovery of a synergy between belonging to the Christian community and identifying belonging to the local environment. There are some Christians that I've met who will openly say, I don't get involved in anything outside church. Shame. It's almost the biggest shame thing a Christian can actually say, isn't it? Because we know that our relationship with Christ drives us to understand that we must engage in the communities in which we're set, even though it's difficult. Paul's vision of the Christian is one who is a new self, described in verse 10 in this chapter. I have put on the new self, which has been renewed in the knowledge in the image of the Creator. This is revolutionary. Our discipleship is not, and we have to be honest and say there are some Christian churches that you almost feel that when you go in, you leave the real world outside. And this becomes the new world. This is the world of religion. And fine, don't call that biblical. Don't. For the struggle that these early churches had was, how can we be Christians in this mix that is both multicultural and challenging? We have to live it out. We have to discover what it means. And it doesn't mean abandoning your belief and truth in the fidelity of Jesus Christ and the good news. But it does mean graciously and honestly asking questions of what it means to engage in community. Our total life requires complete engagement. Our total life requires addressing all unhelpfulness and all separateness. And our life somehow it involves engaging with the challenges that lie before us. Dick Lucas, in his commentary, suggests that the chief business of the Christian can be understood in terms of a living relationship with Jesus Christ and 4 imperatives of Christian spirituality. He suggests, seek the things above. Set your minds on things above. Put to death what is earthly in you and put away the life you once lived. Now, I think Dick is helpful, but I think that has to be placed into the reality that if we have chosen to live where we live, that's where our discipleship must make the greatest difference. And the third and final point is this. Our total life requires no holding back. One aspect of Pauline theology is an understanding of faith and life that is entirely and totally committed. That to me is really what Colossians has to say. It has this wonderful picture of the cosmos, the whole created order as being real, and that Christ is Lord of that cosmos and that world. But at the same time, we are set free to serve. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1938, noting the time, noting the date, and noting the challenges of what it meant for him just before World War II, he wrote his wonderful book that I've commended before called Life Together. It's very modest. I think it only has about 85 pages. And yet it's a moving book on the principles of Christian community. Towards 2,000 years earlier, Paul the Apostle wrote to the church at Corinth. And it was a far from perfect community. There were cliques and power struggles going on. They were plagued by the concept of superiority. And there was a danger of self-destruction. One writer, reflecting on the Corinthian church, said there is both comedy and tragedy at Corinth. There's the comedy of a dynamic, gifted Christian community composed in its early leadership as uneducated, unsophisticated, and uninfluential people. That's what they were at the very beginning. Morals were so bad in Corinth that they even used it as a word for license, to Corinthianize. That was the comedy of that church. But there's tragedy also, as many forgot their humble roots and started to lord it over one another. The resulting tensions and schisms would boil over and concern great, great concern. I remember a very early wedding ceremony. I was very, very green, and the couple came for their final rehearsal. And the bride-to-be looked at me at the final rehearsal and said, "Can we have a bay put into the service?" And stood about a foot behind her was the husband, looking very proud. He was so thrilled that she'd asked this question. So I then said, "Both of you?" He didn't look so happy then when I said that, because I knew that he was coming with all kinds of assumptions about human relationships that were there. You see, the concept of our lives is that we submit all that we have and all that we are to Jesus Christ. And in a mixed up world, that's one of the only ways forward. There was a Hollywood film, called The Bad News Bears. Now, the Bears were a baseball team, that game that I'm regularly commending to you. A team of losers. And Walter Matthau was a wonderful actor, wasn't he? Had that droll, that character that played there. He was the unconventional coach of this team. And he led the team to gain self-respect again as a team. And the bumbling baseball losers became winners again. They thought of themselves as bad news bearers. And so did everybody else. The Christian community has a big task in front of it. And that is, we've got to jump some way from being bad news bearers to being good news bearers. We've got to start to see ourselves again as having something very positive to communicate in our community today. To be people who believe that this good news and this gospel is something that can transform modern Australia and make it something different. What the world needs is good news bearers. Are you going to be one? Are we going to be at Wesley Mission good news bearers in our community? Amen.